Today's topic, we're going to discuss adopting something called DevSecOps, and we're going to look at answering the question on whether DevSecOps is really the solution to sustainable security. As Daniel introduced, I am a Pluralsight author. I've authored several courses in the Pluralsight library, largely around the security space, but I've also written a number of guides and articles around technology leadership and CIO roles and so on and so forth. So in terms of what I'd like to share with you today, and hopefully the key takeaways for you will be understanding where we are exactly at this point in time in terms of technology, in particular the technology development and deployment lifecycle. From there, we'll look at what some of the current key challenges are, and you may recognize some of these from your own organization. Obviously, we'll be focusing on what the security challenges are today for organizations who are deploying enterprise-based applications that need to ensure they're compliant with required security requirements. There's a lot of challenges that companies face in this space today, and we're going to look at what the solutions might be for a sustained security model, not just for dealing with a point-in-time security issue, but for a sustained model. So in terms of looking at the state of the industry, I think we can all agree that things have moved on a long way since the introduction of these floppy disks. So we'll just skip past those. Looking at the software development evolution is something I want to start with. The reason is there's a lot of patterns and practice that have matured within the software development environment, which will translate very well to the security environment. And I believe it will also help us to address some of the challenges that the security environment is facing right now. My background is in software development originally, and currently I'm working in the cybersecurity space. So I can understand the software development challenges that existed several years ago and can actually see some replication of those challenges in the security space today. If we go back to the 60s and 70s, the inception of software development methodology, the best practice at the time was really for organizations to define their requirements up front. And this was typically done in a very thick written documentation format. From there, the design and the architectures of the system would be prepared, which would meet the requirements as set out by the customer. Once the architects and the designers were finished their work, they would involve the programmers to code up the system. And once they had finished, it would be handed over for testing. Once testing was successful, the system went into a live production environment, and from there it was maintained and kept operating, sometimes for decades. This, you may already know, is to be the waterfall methodology. However, several years ago, a lot of problems with the waterfall methodology were solved by adopting something known as an agile methodology. This methodology introduced a much shorter cycle time, where the requirements, the design and the coding and testing was done in much smaller bites. The teams would take certain requirements and would then implement those, test them, and get them released to production before moving on to the next set of requirements. This was known as an agile methodology and has become quite mature. So we have a lot of lessons we can learn from the adoption of an agile methodology. One of the key challenges with the waterfall methodology was that from the time you started the project to the time that you released value, it was a very, very long time frame typically. During that time frame, requirements and demands may change from the business. So more often than not, it required that the project team had to revisit work that they'd already completed before the project could be fully finished out. With the agile methodology, the slices of work are released more frequently. Even though the volume of work is smaller, it releases value sooner to the stakeholders. This means that the stakeholder has the option to make modifications earlier in the process, but it also provides a tremendous feedback loop to the stakeholders earlier than other methodologies. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but later in the presentation, we will come back to borrow some of the patterns that have been presented and learned from the Agile methodology. Here's a great quote, I think, which comes from Mark Zuckerberg, the co-founder of Facebook. Move fast and break things. Mark Zuckerberg suggested that as most companies grow, they slow down too much because they're more afraid of making mistakes than they are of losing new opportunities by moving too slowly. You might see this in your own organization, especially if it's an organization that has grown over time. In the early days, it might have been a small, tight-knit team which were able to make all the changes they needed to get systems into production. But as organizations grow, more bureaucracy or more controls come into the organization in order to preserve and protect the value that's already built. And that means that it can be slower to get new systems to market. Now, Facebook themselves have moved away from this mantra, and their new mantra is move fast with stable infrastructure. So they already have recognized that it's not okay to break things. We'll come back to this later, but I want you to take away the message of the importance of moving quickly. Let's look for a moment at the friction that used to exist between development and operation teams. With development teams, there is a focus on improving the product, improving their output. Changes are frequently undertaken. In order for them to be productive, they need to make change. However, if you look at the operations side of the house, they try to limit change because their focus is on stability, keeping the system as stable as possible to ensure it is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Developers, they tend to own the change. They tend to have a lot of control around what they can do within the system itself in terms of changes. However, on the operations side, engineers usually have to follow strict procedures or SOPs. They're not allowed very much freedom in terms of what they can do with the system. This also leads to additional flexibility for the developers in planning. They can decide and they can agree with the business what changes they want to make in the next release. However, on the operation side of the house, there's usually what's referred to as a change advisory board in play. And the change advisory board must approve all changes. So it's not really at the discretion of the engineer whether a change can go ahead or not. And finally, once released, the developer typically moves on to the next version of the product development. But on the operation side, once a product is released, there's constant monitoring and usually 24-hour, 7-day-a-week support required to ensure the system remains in production. I'm presenting this because you can see that there's a different focus between the two teams. It's not that one is better than the other or one is right and the other is wrong, but their priorities are different. And this inherently leads to problems and friction between two different teams with different focus. Let's have a look and see how this might be solved. Solving the development and operation friction has been achieved by adopting something called DevOps. DevOps merges the development and the ops teams together so that the planning, the coding, the building, and testing is all merged with the releasing, the deployment, the operation, and the monitoring of the system. Now, many people will say that DevOps is a culture and not a team or a process, but really putting the two teams together, giving them joint responsibility to produce and operate the system, and not having segregation whereby the developers hand over the wall to the operations people, the system, then this team is singular in their responsibility to ensure the system meets the business requirements and operates as the business needs it to. The reason I'm showing you this is that the problem of friction between development and operation has already been solved. I'm not saying it's easy to do this in an environment, but those organizations who have achieved a strong DevOps culture have seen tremendous benefits in terms of the speed of which changes can be made, the visibility and transparency across the entire team of the systems that they're operating. Let's move on and see how we can maybe look at this model and learn from it for the security challenges. DevOps, in terms of the definition from Amazon, is the combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools that increases the organization's ability to deliver applications and services at high velocity. Remember, we heard about speed and pace earlier in the webinar. Here we're hearing about high velocity again. Evolving and improving products at a faster pace than organizations using traditional software development and infrastructure management processes. So what's really important for this is that we understand that we're looking for the high velocity aspect in terms of the ability to move fast. If I was to ask you whether or not your organizations see security as contributing to high velocity, then many organizations would answer by saying security is a barrier or it delays us. Let's move on and look at the state of information security. In this, we're going to look at the current practices that exist and pull out some of the friction points that exist today. In any mature organization, security practice has developed over time. There are certain activities that would be deemed to be normal or expected activities within the security function of any, especially medium to large size organization. For example, you might be undertaking activities such as risk assessments or developing security plans for new systems that are being developed. You may have code review processes in place to review the code that is being written by your development teams. You may also have formal penetration testing and vulnerability assessment in place. And all of this might be wrapped together by regular auditing that occurs. These are typical processes you will see in any security program office within medium to large size organizations. What we see here is that it can be very time consuming to book certain resources from the security team to plan and to schedule these activities. So it takes some period of time before the value is released from these activities. You might want to align or liken this model with what we saw in the opening slides, the waterfall methodology. Even though it's not exactly comparable because there is certain independence between these steps, it does resemble some aspects of the waterfall methodology. Let's have a look at some feedback that you might have heard in your organization, or you might hear generally around security. Of course, a lot of this depends on whether you're coming to this webinar from the background of a developer, a security professional, a sysadmin, a leader managing these teams, or indeed someone who has to ensure that products and services that are released by your organization are compliant with relevant laws. Security as an afterthought. It's only when we're ready to release that security get involved, and then they delay things because they need to sign off on the project, because that's the process we have put in place, and that delays and frustrates everyone who has worked on the project. Issues are identified too late in the project. Once off, point-in-time security assessments are useful for that point in time, but quickly become redundant. The days of when software is developed and remains static for months or years are long gone. The whole advantage of software is that changes can be made very rapidly. Performing a point-in-time assessment of a system has little value because it changes so much so quickly. There is value in doing a point-in-time assessment, but it depreciates very rapidly. The cost of retesting is very high. Every time that you make a change to a system, it's usually not practicable to retest based on traditional information security methods. This causes people to form the opinion that security is too slow. And part of that reason is that there isn't enough resourcing available to have a security professional as part of every development team. There is a global shortage of security professionals. Over 1 million vacancies go unfilled every year. The reason for this is that there are too few people with the skills in order to help educate and deliver security practices within development teams. The ratio of security experts to development experts remains incredibly low. Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, in one of his recent podcasts quoted that if you're not embarrassed by your first release, you released too late. The point that Reid was making is that the most valuable thing for a startup organization is to get feedback. It's not more important to wait until your product is well refined and you have all the bugs out of it. He was really emphasizing that you need to get your version 1 or minimal viable product in front of your customers for feedback. This is all fine, and I can understand where Reid was coming from. But one concern here is that if you're embarrassed by releasing your product early, in a security context, that could be very, very damaging. Releasing a product early with a major security flaw could actually end up in killing your project off. So we have to balance some of these views, which are driving a lot of high velocity development, with the requirement to ensure that we're doing it safely. Let's now have a look at a moment at some of the classic approaches for information security, and then we look at how we can map those to be able to do them more quickly and maintain the safety of the systems. I've just pulled out one example of what might be deemed as best practice. For this example, I'm going to leverage the PCI DSS standard, which is the payment card industry data security standard. In their documentation, the standard sets on 11.2 that you must run internal and external network vulnerability scans, at least quarterly, and also after any significant network changes. So typically what organizations do is they initiate a vulnerability scan once per quarter to ensure they're compliant with the requirements. They have a human review the results of that manually run scan, and then after review, if there are any high-risk vulnerabilities, the scan will be rerun again once those vulnerabilities have been addressed. So this is a very manual, once-off type of activity every quarter. What if we were to look at this differently and to undertake a vulnerability scan as part of our software development release pipeline? And if we identify a high-risk vulnerability as part of the code we're developing, then we do not release the software. We do what's known as breaking the build. We stop the pipeline until the high-risk item is addressed. This is really a control put in place to ensure that we remain compliant with the standard. We're still remaining compliant in achieving the requirements of PCI DSS, but we're doing it in a different way, and in a way that's removing some of the manual once-off intervention. Traditional security approaches are really at risk of becoming extinct as we know them. They're being accused of constraining companies' growth and survival, and they're also being blamed for slowing innovation and competitiveness, of being too expensive, and part of that is because of the lack of resources that are available to help drive and build security teams. Let's take a moment and just have a look down through the list of what's called the OWASP Top 10. OWASP produce a list of key areas within web-based applications that developers need to address to ensure their applications are secure. Just take a moment and have a look to see, are you familiar with any of these items? There's some of these that we commonly hear about today. Denial of service, broken access control, injection clause, and so on. What would you think if I told you that this top 10 list was from 2004? That's quite a long time ago in terms of technology years. So much so, in fact, that if you had a phone back then, it would have been one of these type of feature phones, as they were called. And it was a full 3 years before the first iPhone was launched. Now, looking at this list, it feels very dated, doesn't it? Let me bring up the 2017, which is the most recent OWASP Top 10 list. And what's staggering from this is that 6 of the top 10 items identified in 2004 are still present today, 13 years later. So we can draw from this that something is broken in terms of the approach to security, or at the very least, the sustainability of improving security. What are the solutions to this problem? Let's talk now about the main subject, which is DevSecOps. According to Shannon Lates, the DevSecOps approach is really for the purpose and intent of DevSecOps is to build on the mindset that everyone is responsible for security, with the goal of safely distributing security decisions at speed and scale to those who hold the highest level of context without sacrificing the safety required. This is a very interesting definition because it talks about responsibility for security And it moves away from the concept that we have a dedicated security team who handle all the security we require. It mentions that everyone is responsible for security. It also mentions about moving the decision-making process to those who can use all the contextual information that they have at their disposal to make the right decision. So this is a second point where we're saying it's not the security team that makes all the decisions. It's those people who are placed in the best context to make the decisions. And the end of the definition puts the caveat in that we do not want to sacrifice safety of the systems. What this is doing is really opening up the approach to security, to distribute it throughout the organization, to put the decision-making power in the hands of those people who are best placed to make those decisions, but to ensure we do so in a safe manner. This is a very grand statement, and you might be wondering, how does this work practically? So let's have a look. Before we get into some of the detail, I just want to discuss the terms of DevSecOps, which really is about security at the center of everything, and what you might also have heard of is SecDevOps, starting with security and moving forward from there. Some people are aligned to one terminology or the other. From my perspective, I'm going to use the term DevSecOps throughout this presentation. With the agile approach in software development, in the early days, there was something called the Agile Manifesto. For the DevSecOps movement, there is also a DevSecOps Manifesto. I'll give you a moment just to read down through this, and then I'm going to highlight one or two points herein. Okay, so what the manifesto's purpose is really to emphasize certain practices over other practices. It's not saying that you should never do the practices on the right and only do the practices on the left, but it's saying that you should really lean towards doing more of what's on the left and less of what's on the right. In this case, let's pick the first item here, leaning in over always saying no. It's very common for security teams to be known as the team that says no. No, I can't have USB access on my laptop. No, you can't access file sharing websites from your corporate PC using a web browser. No, you can't install whatever software you want on your PC. These are all reasonably common responses from security teams in large organizations. What the manifesto is saying is that instead of always saying no, it should be a case that you get more involved by leaning in with the person raising the request. Find out what they're trying to do, understand how they may be able to achieve that requirement in a safe manner. The answer might still be no, but at least there's more education for the person making the request. I'll just pick out a second one, data and security science over fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You might have heard of this fear, uncertainty, and doubt, also called FUD. And this is where there's lots of hysteria around certain security vulnerabilities or incidents that occur, without much fact or data behind them. What the manifesto is saying is that data and security science should be favored over just getting people to behave in a certain way because of fear or uncertainty. Really, it's coming back to become a data-driven decision. And this will work really well when we talk about the implementation of DevSecOps. I've added a reference below to DevSecOps.org so you can retrieve the manifesto yourself and distribute it with your own teams. So many people might come along with the perception that they can go out and purchase the big DevSecOps product or platform, and that will sort the DevSecOps requirement in their organization and they can move forward. Well, the news is that DevSecOps is not about a single tool. You can't go out and buy a DevSecOps platform and solve your problems around implementing DevSecOps. It's more around the implementation of a culture and process, as we saw in the DevSecOps definition. There is no single tool available that you can go and buy, and it will take some time to develop a culture and embed the correct processes in your organization so that you start operating in a DevSecOps way. Let's jump back to our diagram and see how we can now merge DevOps and Sec to become DevSecOps. First of all, let's start with the planning. From a security perspective, we can introduce concepts such as threat modeling and code standards into the planning stage of every application. In my experience, the development team will really welcome input from the security team that can bring a new focus or a new perspective, and threat modeling can really help with that. Under the coding section, it's very common to have static code analysis. But why don't we look at doing static code analysis in real time? There are toolings available that you can get to add in to most of the common development environments that provide software developers with real-time feedback in terms of the code that they're writing. If they're introducing vulnerabilities in the code, it will provide them with real-time feedback, and they can change those vulnerabilities in the code in real time while they're developing them. When we move on to looking at the build process, once you have your software built, we could then undertake the vulnerability scanning on that software. We don't have to wait until once per quarter or once per year to do this. And similarly with testing. Whilst the functionality and performance testing is underway, why don't we undertake the penetration testing in parallel? From there, we can be sure we identify any security problems early while the development team are still working on this particular release. And so these benefits continue, such as when we release, we can ensure that we have all compliance validation in place. For deployment, we can ensure that the software that is deployed is the code that was tested and built. We can use techniques such as code signing validation. And then when we move on to the operation, this is where security can really provide added value. From a security perspective, we're very used to monitoring and detecting unusual activity with systems. So monitoring, detecting, responding, and recovering all come in to the operate and monitor sections of the cycle. Looking at the DevOps cycle and identifying and mapping where we can add the security practices will really help in terms of producing a single model, the DevSecOps model, to help you secure your application development. What we're trying to achieve by doing this is really security, visibility, and control. Whereas if we do not embed the security practices in the cycle, we're only getting a point-in-time snapshot. It's always better to embed this security, visibility, and control in the development lifecycle. How do we embed it in the lifecycle? Well, we do that by using code. Everything else on the lifecycle is driven by code. For example, code reviews should become code previews. As I explained, there are tools available to plug into the development environment to scan code as the developer is writing the code and flag any dangerous or vulnerable code they're creating. We should also look at things which are very common in security, such as patching. What if we took the concept that We were no longer going to patch, but instead we were going to rebuild our environment on a daily or weekly basis, which contains all the latest patches available. This is a major mind shift compared to the traditional method of patching every 30 days, but it achieves the same result. So we're not losing any compliance obligation violations here. Incident response will still be required in a DevSecOps environment. However, there is an opportunity to reduce the number of incidents that we have. What if we can change the number of incidents and avoid incurring as many incidents by using threat modeling? Again, we look to integrate all of these activities into the pipeline using code. Let's have a look at the pipeline. DevOps usually leverages something called a continuous integration and a continuous delivery pipeline. What we'll have is developers using their source code and repositories, so they're writing code and committing changes to their code repository. Once they have the code prepared, it's usually going to go through a build process where the software is built, all the components are put together, every component is tested individually in a unit test, and then they're tested collectively in what's known as an integration test. This is a distinct phase of the CI/CD pipeline. If everything passes, it moves on to the next phase, which is really around acceptance and publishing or deploying the applications to acceptance environments, to staging environments, and ultimately to production environments where you want to release the value from. Everything in the blue box, everything in the green box here is continuous integration. This is the CI pipeline, and everything in the blue box is continuous deployment, the CD pipeline. Putting them both together, we get the CI/CD pipeline. What if we were now to introduce security into this build pipeline? We would have security design up front. We would help the developers with their code as they're creating it in real time. We would do security testing, just as we do integration and unit testing. And as we have different deployments going to different environments, we would also have a secure environment so that every environment that we build would be done to a secure baseline. What this would give us is something substantial. It gives us repeatable, consistent, and an embedded approach to security. Remember, I mentioned this point-in-time review. We're getting away from this point-in-time review, and we're having a repeatable process coded in to the CI/CD pipeline. This, to my mind, gives us sustainability. Once we integrate our security requirements into the CI/CD pipeline, we can ensure that it remains there throughout the entire lifespan of that application. I want to share with you a few tips in terms of how to get started with introducing DevSecOps in your organization. For those organizations who have not ventured into this space and may be struggling as to how to introduce appropriate security practice, this is a good place to start. First of all, you need to be aware that this is really all about culture. You need to engage with the DevOps team if you have one in your organization. And if you don't, just engage with the development and the ops team separately if you're the security leader. Without this engagement and opening clear dialogues with these teams, you won't achieve any of what we've discussed here. It's important that when you discuss with the development teams, do not bring your current security practices over to the development team and expect them to change how they develop code. What has worked best is that if you change your security practice to align with the development workflow, I'm not saying that you ignore what your requirements are in terms of monitoring and risk assessing and so on. I'm saying you change the practice of achieving that goal. We need to fit in with how the development workflow works, because that is geared towards producing high velocity changes and producing value for the organization. We need to bring security value to that workflow by fitting into it. Every time that a security team approaches the development team, there can be suspicion or nervousness. I would counter that by approaching the teams with the offer of providing visibility and monitoring. At this point in the early days, you're not really interested in enforcement and blocking of the activity or slowing down the pipeline. What's important is that you demonstrate that security, through the changes in the practice, can stay pace with the velocity that the development teams are building so much product on and investing so much time to ensure that that pipeline works smoothly. From there, I would suggest that you expand from the monitoring and the visibility into identifying vulnerabilities and code errors. This is where the security team can become the development team's best friend. And finally, I would suggest that you look at your own security budget, and as you change your practices to align with the development workflow, that you may be able to redirect some security budget to that workflow pipeline, and therefore improving security by ensuring sustainability of security in every release. But you're also going to be seen to be a rock star for bringing additional budget to the CI/CD pipeline. This is a pipeline that the company relies on to ensure that all of the output produced by the development teams continues to flow. So where to from here? Please take some time to check out my own website where I write and blog about certain cybersecurity articles, or you can search for my courses in the Pluralsight library. You'll also actively find me on Twitter at @rharpur. With that, what I'd like to do is thank you for listening and walking through this presentation with me. And we're now going to have a look at some of the questions that might have come in throughout this webinar. If I don't get to answer your specific question, please do connect with me on Twitter or through the Pluralsight forums on the Pluralsight platform, and I'll try and respond to you through those channels. Okay. So in terms of some of the questions that have come through, let's take this one. The first question is, does DevSecOps only apply to cloud-based solutions and development? Well, DevSecOps, in the entire presentation that I've given, I haven't really mentioned cloud-based solutions. So you can apply DevSecOps to any environment. It is true that a lot of the technologies are deployed using cloud-based systems such as Git and other types of shared systems now provide it very easy accessibility through the cloud-based offerings. However, there is nothing to stop you having the CI and CD pipeline built internally within your own infrastructure. It's becoming less common, but there still may be some environments or some regulatory obligations that you have in your own environment so that you need to maintain everything internally. It may be corporate policy or there may be other requirements for that. The technology here is really not the issue. You can have a DevSecOps environment built out inside your own data center. And from that perspective, it will absolutely work fine. You get far greater options and flexibility using some of the cloud services, but the culture and the involvement of security at every step along the workflow still exists in either environment. So just because you may be working on legacy applications, or you may be fully on-premise and not cloud-based, or you might have some restrictions, please don't let that put you off. Remember, it's all about a culture. So the next question I have here is really around having a budget. I don't have a budget for a DevSecOps team. What do you suggest? So as I mentioned regularly throughout the webinar, DevSecOps is not about standing up a new team. That is the DevSecOps team. It's really all around ensuring that you have a culture in place. So if you have developers, and maybe you have some of those developers that are stronger with security concepts and security practices, and you may not be large enough to have a dedicated security team, you still are ideally placed to ensure that the practices for security within your pipeline are embedded in that pipeline so that you get this sustainability we're trying to achieve. Let's have a look here at what some of the other questions are that came in. Okay. Is ISO 27001 the best basis to start as a short checklist? Or can you provide us with other standards that we might start to build on that are easier to set up? Of course, I've picked this question because I have a course in the Pluralsight library on 27001. So it's very, very relevant to my experience. However, 27001 is not a prescriptive standard in terms of the technologies that you use or want to apply. Something like PCI DSS is even more prescriptive than ISO 27001. But in terms of some of the checks, and the listener has suggested to use it as a checklist, you should be looking at what ISO 27001 looks for to ensure that the development process meets all those checks. I think that should be quite easily achieved because the development process and the criteria under 27001 is quite general and it's not very, very comprehensive. So you could start there, but I would also suggest you take 27001 and also something like PCI DSS or some of the NIST standards, the Special Publication 800s. They have a number of mandated requirements for software development. What we're looking for here really is looking at the best practice. So things like code security reviews, that is included in 27001 and also in some of the other standards I mentioned. You can look at these in terms of to-do list. What do I need to do with my development pipeline to ensure that code security reviews are being undertaken? 27001 won't tell you how to do that. That's left entirely up to yourself. But it will serve as a prompt in order for you to understand what might be expected. Let me have a look down through the list and see what other questions we can take in the time that we've left. There's a very interesting question here regarding the rebuilding of environments every few days or weeks. Could you address any challenges that a Windows-based infrastructure might pose versus a Linux-based infrastructure? Is it feasible to rebuild and deploy Windows environments on this cadence? It's becoming a lot more feasible, in particular if you're standing up Windows environments on Azure. Traditionally, yes, the viewer is right, building out a new Windows image was done manually or based on what's called a golden image. However, the newer Windows operating systems are highly configurable using PowerShell and other tools like that. But also, if you look at some of the images that are available from the Azure stores, you can get already hardened images that might meet your security requirements, and the standing up of those environments is entirely feasible with the proper scripting and code. Obviously, the Linux environments are built with a long history of code first, but Windows environments are now quickly catching up. If you have the perception that you cannot stand up a Windows environment using code alone, I would challenge you to try it and to understand what is now available in terms of programmatically configuring the Windows environments. Similar to this, it might be said that if you look at building an environment which has firewalls in place, the traditional approach has typically been that you would submit a request to a security team to request ports to be opened between one device and another device. However, many of the firewall vendors are now shipping devices that are fully compatible with programming APIs, down to the level that you can even configure policies on those devices. This is demonstrating the shift away from once-off, point-in-time manual tasks to having programmatic and repeatable processes embedded in the workflow. So I would challenge you to look at the Windows environment to see how complex your environment needs to be, and look at, in particular, the programmatic elements of the newer Windows operating systems. I'll just see, have we time for one more question here? I love this question. It's from a security perspective, we know that some preventative measures need to be taken, but non-security people may not agree or see the practicality of it. How do we overcome this in a team environment? So I would recommend that the team needs to develop skills in terms of security. So the question is saying a non-security person may not agree. The whole concept of DevSecOps is that everyone becomes a security person. Now, that's not saying that you require every developer to understand all the issues around certificate-based cryptography or undertaking penetration testing, so on. That is not the case. But every developer on that team needs to have an appreciation of why certain things are required. So the best way to approach this is really through example. And I've blogged about this on my website about learning the lessons from data breaches. If you can bring back to your development team examples that have occurred where incidents have happened due to, for example, SQL injection attack on an application that was built. If you can demonstrate how an application was vulnerable to a SQL injection attack and the damage it caused to the organization, then you can very easily explain the need for example, input validation on your web application. So I would suggest you use real-world examples, and these are readily available on the web. You can also look up the HIPAA website, which has a register of incidents that have occurred. In one of my courses, I refer to this so that you can look at the examples in healthcare that have had security incidents and learn from those. That's where we have to wrap it up right now, I think. From my timing perspective, we're nearly out of time. So I'm going to hand back to Daniel, and I'd like to just thank you very much for your time in today's webinar.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Richard. There's been a lot of great material that you shared today, but I just wanted to give you a chance maybe to share one final thought or takeaway with the audience before we hop off.
I think if there's one single takeaway that people can take from this webinar is to ensure if you're in a security team or if you're security focused in your role, make sure that you open the dialogue clearly with the development and the sysadmin teams. DevSecOps is all about a culture and about ensuring that everyone on the team is aware of the security requirements. So instead of looking to buy a new tool or technology, I would say just share experiences and knowledge with your dev team and your sysadmin team. That will help drive forward the interest in security and the ability of the team to implement DevSecOps.